In other videos, I discussed how to make biltong and what to do if things go wrong when you make your biltong. One thing that I haven't spoken about is drywars or droewors. A lot of people who make biltong also want to start making their own drywars. And it's almost an evolution of skill when you can make a good biltong to also make a good drywars. A lot of people are also very unsure of the spices that you use for drywars and then the casings and so on. So in this video, I'm going to be taking you through a couple of basics, just from an understanding perspective, just to give you a little bit of a better idea of what you can do, and for the rest of it, you need to figure it out for yourself. One of the first questions that you could ask yourself is, if I'm going to make drywars, what am I going to need? So you would need a mincer, or at least you would need to buy the mince or ground beef from a butcher or from the supermarket. Ideally, it's always best to have your own equipment because you've got full control over what goes into your meat and what meat you use. And then also, and I'm going to be talking about the ratios a little bit later, but also the ratio of meat to fat that you have full control over. After you've minced the meat or ground the meat, then it needs to go through the spice procedure where you mix and add your spices, you mix it up, and ultimately you would need something called a sausage filler or a stuffer, and that's how you get the meat inside the casing. We'll also be talking about casings because a lot of people are battling with, do I go for natural, do I go for synthetic, which one is right? So the next step that we're looking at is, should I buy trimmings or soft meat or crops when I'm going to make my own drywars, or even boerewors? So should I be using crops or trimmings, or should I use whole muscle? So in other words, should I use maybe a top side or a silver side, a thick flank? What do I do? And as with the biltong video, it really is up to you as to what you want to do. I've done some research around it, and I've done a couple of experiments, and I found that it all depends. Within the South African context, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of confidence in the wholesalers from a supplying perspective. And the reason why I'm saying that is I conducted a yield test, and I've done a number of these yield tests, and unfortunately I didn't keep the data on all of them, but I have conducted one fairly recently. I kept the data with the intention of making the video so that you can see what is it that you get versus what you pay. As an individual with some experience, my preference sits with using whole muscle because, again, you've got full control over what you put into your product, and as opposed to crops or trimmings, and you can work out your meat to fat ratios 100%, and it can be worked out so consistently that you will consistently have a good product. If you've ever bought mince or ground beef, sometimes you get pieces of grit in it. There's, you bite into it, there's something hard in it. Or you buy boerewors and you get that hard piece in it. A lot of people say, oh, but people aren't following the right process. There's something wrong. It's this, and they didn't mince it properly. You know what? The reality is that it's not necessarily, and yes, it's the operator, the manufacturer's fault, but it's not always within their control. And the reason why I'm saying that is a standard practice is to buy crops or trimmings from a wholesaler. Somebody who buys and sells carcasses and then also breaks them down into primal cuts, so you can, instead of buying a full carcass, you can buy primal cuts only. And part of their process is also to supply you with trimmings or crops. Some wholesalers are really good at supplying good quality products. Others are fairly well known for trying to make a quick buck. And unfortunately, the ones who try and make a quick buck tend to be a little bit cheaper because they want to move more volumes. But they don't inspect their product as well as somebody who might be a little bit more expensive, or somebody who goes out to supply only quality. And in reality, in the meat industry, cheaper is best, and cheapest is even better, and therefore we will buy cheapest. Sometimes buying cheap actually ends up being very expensive. And the reason why I'm saying that is, as part of my test, I took a box of crops or trimmings or soft meat, whatever you want to call it, and I started basically splitting the meat, the fat, and then the unusable part. So anything that's unsightly, that's a little bit bloody, that's got connective tissue on it, any sinews. So all of that was then split. And I'm going to be putting it up on the screen, and I'm going to talk you through, when I do a voiceover, I'm going to talk you through the percentages of what my yield was in relation to the starting weight in terms of the box size. And that's why I'm saying I'm not the biggest fan of using crops or trimmings. If you use the whole muscle, you could, for example, use a thick flank. Now, a thick flank, yes, it's got sinews in it, but it's easy enough to break the cut down into the smaller muscles within the cut and to separate the sinews from the meat. It's a very simple process. It doesn't take a lot of time, and you don't necessarily have to go to that extent, because the connective tissue and the sinew that's in the cut, you almost won't even pick it up. Back to the example of, if you've ever had grit in your mince or your ground beef or your sausages, it's because the manufacturer 9 out of 10 times bought trimmings or crops from a wholesaler, or they even produce their own, and it's literally a case of whatever is part of the breaking down the carcass that isn't a primal cut and a full muscle, that goes into a container that eventually gets packed, and that is that's your trimmings or your crops. They try and remove some of the fat, so you won't necessarily find kidney fat or the channel fat in there, but there's very little in terms of control over what percentage of fat goes in there, and it's very difficult to get a consistent meat to fat ratio in that regard. And it's a real pain, really, to have to receive it and then have to do even more work. But the reason why I'm buying it is because it's ready to use. And sometimes, as part of the breaking process, there's a little bit of cartilage or piece of cartilage that comes with, or that ends up in the trimmings. And as a person who makes the product, you don't necessarily know this, because some of those pieces are really small. If you look at a standard procedure within any of the larger organizations that make processed products, if they receive a box or a bag, they will receive it, weigh it, open it, and it'll go onto the mincer. And then it goes through the mincer. So it doesn't really go through a process of, let me check it, let me make sure everything's okay, because the assumption is that if I bought it as trimmings or crops, it's ready to use. Some places even sell it as an 80-20 or a 70-30 or a 90-10 meat to fat ratio, and you assume that is correct. And that's, to a very large extent, why people make inconsistent products, other than having a clever butcher that eyeballs the spices and that really just doesn't follow any proper procedure. But that's, for the most part, why you have very inconsistent types of products, and sometimes it's very fat, sometimes it's less fat. And the problem comes in as well with a product like boerewors, which is highly regulated, and you're not allowed to have a certain percentage of, or more than a certain percentage of fat versus meat. And the regulations are such that you, by law, you actually have to check your meat fat ratio. So by buying crops or trimmings, you actually make more work for yourself. So back to then whole muscle. If you, for example, need to make 10 kilograms of boerewors or drywors, because it works on exactly the same principle. If you need to make 10 kilograms, the easiest way to do it is if you want to use 80-20, and again, it's something that's up to you. You need to decide what you want to do and what you don't want to do and what you're comfortable with. But from a boerewors perspective, you can't use a 70-30 ratio. It works amazing for products like hamburger patties. But for boerewors, you need to stick to that 80-20 meat to fat ratio. For drywors, some people like the 70-30. It also depends on the type of fat that you use. Some people like to use the 80-20 sort of ratio. And again, it's up to you. You need to decide what works for you, what doesn't work for you. So if you need to make 10 kilograms, 8 kilograms of your batch must be pure meat. No sinews, no connective tissues, no fat, no nothing. And this is a very simple explanation because I'm not factoring in water and spices and the weights of those. It's merely just to get your ratios right. So for 80%, so it's 8 kilograms of meat and then 2 kilograms of either, so you can use fat, you can use beef fat. At the very, very minimum, it has to be body fat, a body fat of some sorts. Please do yourself a favor, don't use things like kidney fat or channel fat. That's the hard fat. If you ever have had boerewors or drywors, especially drywors, that once you take a bite, it sort of makes the fat, sort of makes a layer on your palate, then you know it was the wrong fat that they used. Those pieces of fat also, it doesn't melt easily, so it doesn't exactly melt in your mouth. It's that sort of hard pieces. It's not great, and it also doesn't taste great. So that's what you don't want to use, is that kidney fat or channel fat. What a lot of people do is they'll then take, it's an 80-20 ratio, 8 kilograms or 80% of pure muscle, pure meat, 1 kilogram of body fat, or alternatively, if you can, you must get brisket fat, because it's so soft, it's very oily, it's actually very good for you. And then you can also use, for the other kilogram, you can also use sheep tail fat if you can get. It also brings in a very nice flavor, and it's nice and soft. It's very similar in consistency to brisket fat. So what you also, within the South African context, if it gets, like now, it's getting closer to winter, the brisket fat is starting to get on the scarce side. We're going into hunting season. There's a lot of hunters here, and the majority of them have or process their meat themselves, and they make things like biltong and drywors and so on. So they like to use the brisket fat. So a lot of the wholesalers are starting to slowly but surely hold back on the brisket fat, and that supply and demand situation will then start raising the price on brisket fat. To give you an idea, you can, in some cases, let's say your trimmings or your crops, if you buy it out, it's 65 Rand a kilo before VAT. Your brisket fat could go up to 45 Rand a kilo before VAT. So, and fat is generally something that it's cheap, and you almost want to throw it away because there's not a lot that you can do with it. The channel fat or the kidney fat, it's generally used for the cheaper type of sausages, not necessarily a boerewors. So that really is the idea between using crops or trimmings versus whole muscle. And that's something that you will have to work out for yourself. The next thing we look at is your spices. If you've been making your own biltong for a while and you've figured out your own recipe, I like to tell people to use that recipe, use your biltong recipe, because you've already perfected your product. When you make drywalls, use that recipe that you've got and make a 1 or a 2 kilogram sample and taste it. See what it does. What you might want to do is add a bit of fat. Like I said, if you make biltong, it tends to be very lean, and sometimes you've got that little bit of fat on the side. But in terms of percentage, it adds so little to your meat fat ratio that you might have to tweak it a little bit. So you might want to make provision for fat. Because you add fat, sometimes you want to make provision to add a little bit more salt, because the salt and the fat, they balance each other out very nicely. You might want to go a little bit easier on the coriander, depending on how much coriander is in your biltong recipe. But it really, again, it's up to you. It's you need to figure out what works for you. But a good base and a good starting point is, if you have a good biltong recipe, try that and see what that does for you. A lot of people want to go and reinvent the wheel, and it's really not necessary. It's working from a solid base is always a lot easier than to try and start something from scratch. In terms of casings, the question comes up: should I use natural casings or should I use synthetic casings? Now, natural casings, it always, if you want to go for the organic sort of route, the closest you can get is obviously using natural casings. For boerewors, you would use hog casings or pork casings. Those are the bigger ones. Or for drywalls or for your cocktail sausages, it's generally it's sheep casings. Sheep casings it's a little bit more difficult to work with it because it's so small. It makes your process a little bit longer. It's also, if you use a hand filler, it also takes a little bit longer to make your product because it's so finicky, because the casings tear very quickly. And then when you go back to your recipe, you need to add some liquids to it to make your mix very pliable, so that it can go through a funnel the size of my pinky, and without stripping your machine, breaking your arm, or just taking forever to make the product. So you can add some water, you can add some Worcester sauce. The Worcester sauce, it really makes it very dark, but it adds a very nice flavor to it. Generally, you wouldn't use a lot of vinegar, not in your drywalls. But again, it's up to you. You need to go and figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Just remember that if you add a lot of liquids into it, you might end up with a longer drying time because you need to get rid of the majority of that moisture. But then at the same time, the more water you add, the more your weight loss will be, because you've got a lot of weight that you need to shed through the drying process. So again, I'm a big fan of using natural casings. It's in South Africa, within our context, it's cheaper to buy a bundle of casings than to buy a box of synthetic casings. And the reason for that is the synthetic casings comes in a box, and nobody wants to open a box and sell you that. If you get it, it's going to be expensive, but it's few and far between that you find it. In other parts of the world, synthetic casings are a lot more freely available, so they tend to be cheaper than the natural casing. So ultimately, it depends on you, depends on what you want to do. If you're going to make it from a commercial perspective, it presents well in a synthetic casing, because you can get your thickness is almost 100% spot on. If you want to use, you want to weigh off little sticks, you can almost, you fill it and you use a ruler and you measure it, and that measurement will give you a certain weight, and you can almost use that as a uniform approach, and you can be generally accurate when it comes to that. Where with the natural casings, because some parts are thicker, some are thinner, so it looks a lot more on the homemade side if you use the natural casings. A lot of people ask the question, can I use, is there, with the synthetic casings, is it vegetarian, is it vegan, what's the story? Unfortunately, it's not, because it's made from collagen. So any collagen comes from the hooves of the animal, so it's not friendly for any other purposes. Even the manufacturers that sometimes, I don't know what goes on in their heads, but the manufacturers that sometimes make the vegan products or the vegetarian products, especially the vegan products, they make these vegan sausages and they use collagen casings. In that there's a fundamental flaw in your product, and I'm hoping that you don't sell that to people as a vegan product. The alternative is to use 100% synthetic, 100% plastic casing, but that casing is not edible. So you basically add a process to your manufacturing process, because once your product is dry, you need to strip that casing and just so you just sit with the meat, because it's not edible. It's also a person will fairly quickly figure out that it's not edible, but it's not going to give a good impression of your product. The synthetic casing can sometimes be a little bit on the tough side. It all depends on the manufacturer. It depends on the ingredients that they use to make it. It's all, again, the whole process. It's a very personal process. People are very quick to say, oh, I like this person's product, I like that person's product. It's so difficult to keep everybody happy. You need to go and find a product and a process that works for you, that makes your life a lot easier, as easy as possible, and then stick with that product. One of the key things to making draaiwors and boerewors is consistency. You have to be consistent. If you can't fluctuate in terms of tastes and flavors and so on. So do your testing, and that's what I'm saying. Use your biltong recipe, add a bit of liquids into it, add some Worcester sauce, add some water, make it a nice and pliable mixture, put it in a casing, dry it and test it. Give it to people, do sampling, and find out what works for you. But make sure that you always keep a record of your whole process and all your ingredients. And you'll fairly quickly find out what people like and what they don't like. And I'm always saying, if you like your own product, it's a good start. So make sure that you are also ultimately happy with what you manufacture. Because if you sell it on, or you give it on to somebody else, you don't want to have that worry in your mind that, oh, somebody's going to think this is not great. If the quality is there, if you follow the right processes, then it is what it is. If the person doesn't like the taste, unfortunately, there's not a lot that you can do about it. But as long as your basic processes and basic principles are 100% the same. Let me show you the photos of what I have, what yielded from my experiment, and you can decide for yourself whether you want to go for whole muscle or whether you want to buy trimmings or crops or mince, and it all depends on the type of control that you want and from a consistency perspective. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really enjoy making these videos. I enjoy sharing my experiences with people. And if you like the video, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, drop a comment in the comment section below, and let's have a good debate going as to what works for you, because there's a lot of new people out there who want to start getting into it as a hobby. There's a lot of people who want to get into it as a business, and we all need to start somewhere. And I reckon videos like these give people a really good indication of what to do before, what to know before I start making.
I conducted a block test to figure out what's going to be best for me, whether I should buy primal cuts or whole muscles, or whether I should buy trimmings or crops or soft meat or whatever it's called in your region. I took the box, opened it up, I then started splitting all my clean meat as far as possible. I split all the fat, all the scraps, And then I also weighed the liquids that were present in the bag. As you can see from the picture, my meat isn't 100% lean. So there is quite a large percentage of fat in it already. I'm sitting with 5,435 kilograms of meat, and in the next photo you'll see I also have 5,127 kilograms, and that gives me a total of 11 kilograms of crops or trimmings or soft meat or whatever you want to call it. I also ended up with 4,2 kilograms of fat, and that gave me a roughly 23.3% of the total box was fat. It's usable, although it's not the greatest. It's not only body fat, it's not only good fat, there are some hard pieces in between, but just from a basic calculations perspective, roughly 23.3%. Next up, we have the scraps. 2,25 kilograms of this. So this makes up around 12.5% of the total weight. The scraps is what gives you all the hard pieces. There's potential cartilage in it, but it gives you all the hard pieces, all the sinewy parts that you don't want in your sausage. This is what you 100% want to split and eliminate from going into your product. So this 12.5% then shows a direct loss. I had a starting weight of 18 kilograms. That shows me that if I take off 61% for the meat, 23.3% for the fat, 12.5% of scraps, I then sit with roughly 3.3% additional loss. So that would be in the form of the liquid or the myoglobin that stays in the bag. And that's the longer you leave meat in a container, the more moisture it'll lose. So I'm sitting with a 15, almost 16% loss before I even started doing anything. And it's already not looking great. If I add all my calculations together and I look at this holistically, I've lost 183 Rand and 64 cents roughly. That's a direct loss, and then I haven't lost any moisture through the drying process. So already it tells me that this is not the right way to go. I am therefore much better off buying whole muscle, even though it might be slightly more expensive, but I don't have to waste the time in splitting the meat, the fat and the scraps, and I don't sit with that direct loss. So sometimes paying a little bit more but being able to use 100% of what you buy is worth more than to try and save a bit of money and you still have to spend the time. Your time is worth more than anything else, and therefore, all in all, it's much better to just buy the primal cuts, cut them up, and you can also get your ratios 100% correct without spending unnecessary time splitting anything. I have separate videos on how to use a meat grinder or a mincer, and also how to make sausages using a sausage filler. So following this, I'm going to show you brief extracts just quickly to give you an idea, just to complete the process.